but you radically changed the life of your family. You managed to have your family stop eating meat, for example. How did you do that, and what did it take to convince them?
I made them feel so guilty. I made them feel so guilty. I made them feel so guilty. And then they decided to do those changes because I have made them feel very guilty. Because I have made them feel very guilty.
About how and why veganism leads to malnutrition. This is a difficult subject for me. If you've watched my intro video, you know I was vegan for 16 years. Let me tell you something about vegans. No one becomes a vegan intending to hurt themselves or others. At their core, vegans are kind-hearted and compassionate people who want to make a difference. If you're wondering why some of the vegans you've met don't strike you as kind or compassionate, that's because when you starve the body and the brain, you are unable to regulate your emotions. Your hormonal system becomes completely unbalanced. 2 months after I stopped being vegan and started to nourish myself with wholesome animal products, I stopped feeling stress and anxiety. I wasn't expecting it. I didn't know just how stress and anxious I was until they were gone.
Is a vegan diet the answer to climate change? Eating less meat will reduce my carbon footprint, right? Unfortunately, it isn't that simple. It isn't black and white. I'm not trying to tell anyone how they should or shouldn't eat. Everyone is free to do whatever they want, but I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a different perspective. So in case you've been living under a rock, I will tell you what veganism is. Basically, someone who follows a vegan diet doesn't eat any animals or animal products. So no meat, obviously, but then no dairy, no eggs, not even honey in a lot of cases. There are 3 main reasons why someone might go vegan. Number 1, because they think it's healthier. Number 2, because they think it's better for the environment. And number 3, because they think it reduces animal suffering and killing. Environmental impacts, specifically in Australia, and a little bit on the animal suffering component as well. I am going to be making my case for why a vegan diet isn't the best option to solve either of these issues. All of the animals I just mentioned need to be hunted, or else they're just going to breed out of control. There are currently 2.3 million feral goats in Australia, and if they aren't hunted, their population doubles in a year and a half. So these animals are destroying the land, they're overgrazing, they're hunting native Australian species, and they're breeding like crazy. And if you aren't convinced that something like a rabbit can have that big of an impact, just take a look at what they have done to Phillip Island. These first photos are from the 1980s, when there was a huge rabbit population on the island. And the second set of photos is from 2008, after these rabbits had been eradicated. As I said before, rabbits also compete with native Australian species for food and shelter. Since European settlement, 30 Australian species have gone extinct, and 1,700 species of plants and animals are in danger right now. So the point I'm trying to make here is that these animals need to be hunted. It isn't as simple as don't kill any animals and everyone's going to live happily ever after. Hunting and eating these animals is the best option for the environment. But you know what? My feelings are irrelevant. And this is the problem I have when vegans use the argument of intent. So basically, this argument is used a lot to justify animal killing that happens in the production of things such as wheat and soy. In Australia, at least 100 mice are killed per hectare per year to grow grain. If you look at what it takes to get 100 kilos of wheat that we can eat and compare that to what it takes to get 100 kilos of beef, over 25 more mice have to die than cattle to get the same amount of food. And that's just looking at mice. We're not even talking about reptiles, small mammals, and insects. So to use the term mentioned earlier from the Department of Environment and Energy, it is a net humane to eat beef over grains. And a quick side note before you try to argue that most grains are going to feed cattle, that's not true. In Australia, 2/3 of cattle are 100% grass-fed, and the remaining ones are mainly fed grass and just finished on grains. Most of these grains are grown for human consumption. Anyways, getting a little bit sidetracked. When I bring this point up to someone who's vegan, their response is always, but it wasn't intentional. That argument is basically an admission that you don't really care about the animals. Animals are still dying, and at higher rates. But it's okay, because you didn't mean to do it. This argument tells me you are valuing your conscience, you're valuing your feelings over animal suffering. And I'm sorry, if you think no animals are dying just because they're not on your plate, that's extremely naive. The bottom line is animals need to be killed in order for Australia to maintain its natural wildlife and remain the beautiful country that it is. It makes sense to make the most of the situation and use these hunted animals to their full potential. We can eat this meat and benefit from the high nutritional value that it provides.
World where the United Science tells us that we are about 11 years away from setting off an irreversible chain reaction way beyond human control that will probably be the end of our civilization as we know it. We live in a strange world where no one dares to look beyond our current political systems, even though it's clear that the answers we seek will not be found within the politics of today. Our civilization is so fragile, it is almost like a castle built in the sand.
Changed the life of your family. You managed to have your family stop eating meat, for example. How did you do that, and what did it take to convince them?
But then I made them feel so guilty. I just kept telling them that they were stealing our future and that you cannot stand up for human rights while you are living that lifestyle. And then they decided to do those changes because I have made them feel very guilty. The facade is so beautiful, but the foundations are far from solid. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth.
What changed your life once you started to learn about climate change?
I personally have stopped flying. I have stopped eating meat and dairy.
Svante, how has your daughter changed you?
I had to go vegan. First I went vegetarian, then I had to go vegan.
And why did you stop eating meat?
Both of ethical reasons and by ecological reasons.
Factors into a natural rise in CO2 and temperature over the last century completely separate from human action. On the flip side, as temperatures decrease, it can trigger events that cause the Earth to rob the atmosphere of much-needed CO2, and there have been several examples in history where CO2 has fallen to dangerous levels. If we look at ice core samples from the Antarctic, we know that during the last glacial maximum around 18,000 years ago, atmospheric CO2 concentrations descended close to 180 parts per million, only 30 parts per million above the level required to sustain life. Within a single generation of exposure to low CO2, modern plants show an average reduction in photosynthesis and biomass production of 50%, which directly impacts all other life on Earth. Even today, our current CO2 levels are a lean diet for most plants, because most plants that exist today evolved during a time of high CO2 concentrations. The benefits of carbon dioxide supplementation on plant growth and production are well known, as hundreds of studies have shown that plants benefit from enriched atmospheric CO2 concentrations. This has been easiest to study in a greenhouse environment, where increasing CO2 to 1,000 parts per million will actually increase photosynthesis by about 50% compared to regular ambient CO2 levels.
Let that sink in. Veganism is not possible in a global ice age. Plants do not grow when it is cold. Veganism is only possible in a warmer climate. That's why we evolved to eat meat. This is what's always available. Meat, not plants.
So what happens when CO2 levels in our atmosphere increase? Well, exactly what you would expect. It has a greening effect that's been observed in up to half of Earth's vegetated lands over the last 35 years. According to a new study, it's estimated that 70% of this greening effect is caused by increased levels of CO2. In the last century, plants have been growing at a rate far faster than in any time in the last 54,000 years. It's Miracle-Gro. And while climate alarmists say that this won't last because temperatures rising will cause mass droughts and decrease water that plants need, increased temperatures actually lead to increased precipitation. Also, more vegetation leads to more transpiration, which leads to more rainfall. More rainfall leads to more vegetation. In the last decade, record-breaking rainfall events have occurred in many places around the world. Water flow will actually increase over the century. This is why we're seeing a greening effect in places that are normally too arid to promote that kind of growth. It's estimated that by the end of this century, global biomass will have increased by 40%. And since we're also currently experiencing warmer temperatures, this creates longer growing seasons and faster growth rates for plants. Longer growing seasons means more CO2 from the atmosphere will be metabolized by these plants, as seen in this NASA model when it turns from winter to spring. In fact, plants are converting 31% more carbon dioxide into organic matter than they were before the Industrial Revolution. This means that we're getting far more food from each acre of land than we were a century ago. Look, the Earth is doing fine. I can't necessarily say the same for mankind, though. In comparison, low CO2 levels during the Little Ice Age from about 1300 to 1850 were likely responsible for the bad harvest experienced in this time, as we know from the records kept by monks and winemakers. Bad harvests lead to starvation of millions of people, poverty, and civil unrest.
People are suffering. People are dying.
Unlike what Greta is trying to propagate, not only do more people starve during cold periods, a recent study showed that deaths from cold are about 21 times higher than those from heat. In fact, climate-related deaths have dropped from 500,000 per year in the 1920s to less than 25,000 per year in the last decade. And despite the propaganda, heat waves have not increased, drought and flood have not increased, neither have hurricanes or wildfires, and tornadoes have decreased significantly since the 1950s. And how can this level of warming be so dangerous if it remains well below the natural temperatures of several prior interglacial periods? We know from history that humans and the biosphere typically do better during warm periods with higher levels of CO2. So if it's actually true that humans can engineer and control global temperatures, why isn't anyone asking what global temperature is optimum? What if we're unknowingly helping the Earth reach a Goldilocks point by releasing CO2 where conditions are just right for our biosphere the way termites did 300 million years ago? And it's ironically these so-called eco-warriors who are actually trying to impede that process. And while there are causes for naturally occurring emissions of CO2 like volcanic activity and termites, there's no evidence that large volumes of new CO2 have been added to the atmosphere during the 140 million year decline leading up to the present era. In fact, it's been steadily decreasing on a trend where life could have extinguished itself in a short geological time from now had man not released sunken carbon back into the air. Therefore, in the absence of human-caused emissions, it could reasonably be presumed that CO2 levels would have continued to fall as they had done for the previous 140 million years, which brings me to this important question. How long would it have been in the absence of human-caused CO2 emissions until the gradual depletion of CO2 in the atmosphere fell well below life-sustaining levels, signaling the beginning of the end for all life on Earth?